She bought a burned silo for $2. Heinrich Voth, who had survived 11 Kansas winters, told her plainly, "Go to town before the snow comes. Go before you kill those children." She had $2, 3 children, and needed 6 cords of fuel she could not cut. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 50 degrees in 3 hours. But 5 months earlier, Margaret Roth had never spent a single winter on the Kansas prairie. She had arrived in Rush County in the summer of 1881, a bride of 23, stepping off a wagon into a sea of grass that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Her husband Johann had filed the claim the year before. He had built a sod dugout into a low hillside, and he promised her that within 2 years they would have a proper stone house, like the ones they had left behind in Russia. 6 years passed. The stone house remained a foundation, 12 feet by 14 feet of carefully laid limestone, rising 18 inches above the prairie before Johann's body gave out. Cholera took him in July of 1887. He died on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Margaret had buried him in the plot behind the dugout, the same ground where he had planned to plant apple trees. She was 29 years old. She had 3 children, Anna, who was 6, Peter, who was 4, and Wilhelm, who was 11 months old and still nursing. She had $2.40 in a tin box beneath the floorboards. She had a sod dugout whose roof beams were rotting and whose walls were beginning to slump inward with each rain. And she had a homestead claim that required 3 more years of continuous residence and improvement before it would belong to her. The neighbor women came first. They brought bread and salt pork and quiet advice. Sell the claim, take the children to Hayes, find work as a domestic. A woman alone cannot prove up a quarter section. The words were kind. The message was clear. You cannot do this. The neighbor men came next. They took Johann's tools, his saws, his chisels, his levels and squares. They took the firewood he had been stacking for winter, 6 cords of cottonwood hauled 40 miles from the Smoky Hill River. They called it Christian redistribution. They said Johann would have wanted his neighbors to have use of what he could no longer use. They left Margaret with a quarter cord of twisted branches and the clothes on her children's backs. By August, she understood the mathematics of her situation. A Kansas winter required shelter that could hold heat. Her dugout would not survive another season. The center beam had cracked, and each rainfall brought dirt sifting down onto her children's beds. A Kansas winter required fuel. She had a quarter cord of scraps. A family of 4 needed 6 to 8 cords to survive until spring, or 2 to 4 tons of coal at $18 to $72, more money than she had seen in 3 years. A Kansas winter required food stores, flour, dried beans, salted meat, preserved vegetables. She had 40 pounds of flour and whatever she could grow before frost. The numbers did not add. They never came close to adding. Heinrich Voth arrived on a morning in late August, when the heat pressed down like a wool blanket, and the children lay listless in the shade of the dugout's slumping doorway. He was 52 years old, a stonemason who had come to Rush County with the first wave of Volga German settlers in 1876. He had survived 11 Kansas winters. He had built 14 stone houses for families across the county, including the foundation that Johann had paid him to start and never finished. Margaret met him in the yard. She had rehearsed what she would say. She would offer to work, cooking, cleaning, laundry for his family in exchange for his labor finishing Johann's foundation, walls and a roof, a proper house. She would do anything. Voth listened. He walked to the foundation and examined the stones Johann had laid. He pressed his palm against the limestone and looked out across the prairie where the August grass was beginning to yellow. He was silent for a long time. "The foundation is solid," he finally said. "Your husband was a careful man, 12 by 14 feet, walls that would have been 20 inches thick. A good small house. Then you can finish it, Margret said. Voth shook his head. To raise walls and a roof would take 300 hours of skilled labor. Even with your help, I cannot spare the time before winter. I have 2 houses promised already, and the Brenner family is waiting for their chimney repair. I can pay you in spring, after harvest. You have no crop in the ground. You have no husband to plant one. What will you harvest? Margret had no answer. Voth looked at her then, not unkindly. He had daughters of his own. He had buried a wife in Russia before coming to America. He understood what it was to stand alone with nothing but children and dirt. Go to Hayes, he said. Take the children. Find work as a domestic servant. There are good families there who need help. Your children will eat. You will have a roof that does not leak. And the claim? Abandon it. The land will go back to the government. Someone else will file. It is only dirt, Mrs. Roth. It is not worth dying for. Margret looked at the foundation her husband had laid. The stones were still sharp-edged, not yet weathered. Johann had believed they would build a life here. He had believed it until the fever took him. I cannot leave, she said. Voth's expression hardened. Not with cruelty, with certainty. He had seen too many winters. He had seen what happened to people who believed they could survive on hope. Then you will die here, he said. A stone foundation is not a house. You cannot raise walls alone. You cannot cut enough fuel. A woman with 3 children and no husband has no business on a claim in winter. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was flat and final. Go to town before the snow comes. Go before you kill those children. He left without looking back. His wagon raised a plume of dust that hung in the still air long after he was gone. Margret stood in the yard. Anna came to stand beside her, small fingers wrapping around her mother's hand. Peter was crying inside the dugout, hungry again, always hungry. Wilhelm was silent against her chest, too young to understand, too young to know that the man in the wagon had just pronounced their death sentence. 10 weeks until winter, $2.40, a quarter cord of firewood, a dugout that was collapsing, a stone foundation that could not become a house. She walked back to the dugout, carrying Wilhelm against her chest. Anna and Peter were playing in the dirt outside. She had 10 weeks, $2.40, and no idea how to keep her children alive through winter. That was when she heard about the auction. The sheriff's auction was held on the first Saturday of September in the yard behind the general store in La Crosse. Margret walked the 4 miles with Wilhelm strapped to her back and Anna holding Peter's hand. She had heard that auctions sometimes offered tools and lumber for pennies. Perhaps she could find a saw. Perhaps she could find nails. Perhaps she could find something, anything, that would give her one more option than she had now. The auction drew a small crowd, farmers looking for equipment, merchants looking for inventory to resell, a few women like Margaret standing at the edges, hoping for scraps. The auctioneer worked through the lots quickly. A plow went for $12. A set of harnesses went for $8. A barrel of nails went for $3, more than Margaret had. She watched each lot pass with a growing certainty that she had walked 8 miles round trip for nothing. Then the auctioneer announced the Krieger property. The Kriegers had been German-Russian settlers like the Roths. They had arrived in 1879 and filed a claim 6 miles north of town. They had built a sod house, then a small barn, then, unusual for the area, a stone granary for storing wheat. The granary was cylindrical, built of native limestone, with walls 22 inches thick and a height of 18 feet. It had taken 2 summers to build. In the spring of 1887, the barn caught fire. The flames spread to the house. Karl Krieger died trying to save his horses. His widow Anna salvaged what she could and fled to relatives in Hayes. The claim went to auction for back taxes. The auctioneer described the property: 160 acres of unimproved land, a burned foundation where the house had stood, the charred remains of a barn, and one stone granary with fire damage to the roof. "The granary is intact," the auctioneer said. "Stone walls standing 18 feet high, but the roof burned clean through. Nothing but walls and sky now. Starting bid, $5 for the granary and salvage rights to the debris." Silence. $3. Silence. $2. "Come now, gentlemen, $2 for good limestone walls." Margaretta did not know why she raised her hand. The granary was useless, a roofless stone tube charred and abandoned. You could not live in it. You could not store grain in it without a roof. It was a monument to the Kriegers' failure, nothing more. But the walls were 22 inches thick. She remembered that. And 22 inches was nearly 2 feet of solid stone. $2 to the woman in back. Do I hear $2.50? Silence. Sold. $2 to Mrs. Roth, Margaret said. Margaret Roth. She paid with coins from the tin box. She had 40 cents left. The auctioneer handed her a deed of salvage and pointed north. 6 miles that way. Take what you want, leave what you don't. It's yours now. Margaret walked home with the deed folded in her pocket. Anna asked what she had bought. Margaretta did not know how to answer. She had bought a burned stone cylinder with no roof, no floor, no doors, and no purpose. She had bought it because the walls were thick, and because she had remembered something. The Volga Germans who had settled Rush County came from a land of brutal winters. In Russia, on the steppes along the Volga River, temperatures dropped to 40 below and stayed there for weeks. The German colonists had learned over generations how to survive. They built their houses with walls of clay brick, nearly 3 feet thick. They called them Erdhäuser, earth houses. The walls absorbed heat during the day and released it through the night. Margarete's grandmother had called it Sonnengedächtnis, the sun's memory. On the coldest nights, the walls would be warm to the touch, radiating the heat they had stored when the sun was high. The principle was simple. Thick walls held heat the way a clay pot held water. The more mass, the more memory. A thin-walled house lost heat as fast as you could make it. A thick-walled house held yesterday's warmth and gave it back slowly, stretching each fire into hours instead of minutes. Margrethe had grown up in those houses. She had pressed her palms against those warm walls on winter nights when the wind screamed outside. She had known, as a child knows without being taught, that the walls were alive in some way, breathing out warmth when the cold pressed in. But she had never built one. And the granary was not a house. She visited it the day after the auction. The walk was 6 miles each way, and she carried Wilhelm the entire distance. Anna and Peter stayed with a neighbor, one of the few who would still watch them, in exchange for Margaretta's promise to bring back any useful debris from the burned barn. The granary stood alone on the prairie, a cylinder of blackened limestone rising against the sky. The roof was gone entirely. Charred timbers had collapsed inward and lay in a heap on the dirt floor. The walls were streaked with soot, the mortar blackened, the stones dark with smoke. But the stones themselves were unbroken. Fire did not burn limestone. The walls stood plumb and solid, 18 feet high, 12 feet across. The interior was a perfect circle, roughly 113 square feet, smaller than her dugout, smaller than any house she had ever seen. She stepped inside through the doorway where the Kriegers had once loaded wheat. The interior smelled of ash and old rain. Above her, open sky. Around her, stone walls that had survived a fire that killed everything else. She pressed her palm against the stone. Cool. In the September heat, with the sun beating down, the interior of the stone cylinder was cool. The walls had absorbed the cold of the previous night and were releasing it slowly, like a clay pot releasing water. Sonnengedächtnis. The sun's memory worked both ways. The walls remembered cold. The walls remembered heat. Whatever you gave them, they held, and whatever they held, they gave back. Margaret stood in the center of the burned granary and did the calculations she had been too afraid to do before. A normal cabin, 200 square feet, thin wooden walls, perhaps 4 inches thick, heat escaping constantly through the wood, through the gaps, through every crack and seam. To keep such a cabin warm required burning fuel constantly, all day, all night, more fuel than she could ever gather. This granary, 113 square feet. Stone walls 22 inches thick, more than 5 times the mass of a wooden wall. Heat absorbed slowly, stored in the stone, released slowly. The small space meant less air to warm. The circular shape meant no corners where wind could find cracks. What if the walls could do the work? What if she did not need to heat a house at all, only to heat the walls? The idea was mad. She knew it was mad. A granary was not a house. There was no roof, no floor, no chimney. She would suffocate from smoke or freeze from drafts. Heinrich Voth would laugh. Everyone would laugh. But the walls were warm in summer and would be warm in winter too if she gave them heat to hold, and she had no other options. She was still standing there when she heard footsteps behind her. Anna Krieger looked older than her 44 years. She had walked from town, following the same path Margaret had taken. She wore black, the color of widows, and her face held the emptiness of someone who had lost everything and expected to lose more. "I heard you bought it," Anna said. She did not step inside. She stood in the doorway, looking at the walls her husband had built. "I did." "Why?" Margareta hesitated. The truth sounded foolish even in her own mind. "The walls are thick." Anna stared at her. Then she laughed, a short, bitter sound. "The walls are thick. My husband spent 2 summers building thick walls. 2 summers in the heat, cutting stone, laying mortar. He said it would last 100 years. She looked up at the empty sky where the roof had been. "It did not save him. It will not save you." "I know it is not a house." "It is not anything. It is a stone tube, a grain bin. What will you do, store yourself like wheat?" Margaret did not answer. Anna stepped closer. "There is no floor, just dirt. No windows, no chimney. You cannot burn a fire inside without choking on the smoke. You cannot stay warm without a fire. You will suffocate or freeze. Those are your choices." "I can cut a hole for a chimney." "Through 22 inches of stone, with what? Your fingernails?" "With a hammer and chisel, inch by inch." Anna shook her head. The bitterness had drained from her voice, leaving only exhaustion. "My husband died in that barn. He ran into the fire because he thought he could save the horses. He was a strong man, stronger than you. He built these walls with his own hands, and when the fire came, the walls did nothing. They stood there and watched him burn." She turned and walked away back toward town. At the doorway, she paused. "My husband built this for wheat," she said. "We never thought of it as a house, and it is not one. Whatever you think you see in these walls, it is not there." Margaret watched her go. The footsteps faded. The wind moved through the open roof, stirring ash on the floor. She looked at the walls. 22 inches of solid limestone, standing 18 feet high, built to hold wheat through the seasons. The Kriegers had never thought to live in it. Why would they? They had a house. Margaret had a collapsing dugout and $2.40. She began calculating what she would need. A roof, she could not buy lumber, but the burned barn still had timbers. Charred, yes. Weakened, perhaps, but standing beneath the debris. A chimney, she would cut the hole herself, 22 inches of stone. 22 days of chipping if she could manage an inch per day. A floor, packed dirt, would work. The Volga Germans had used packed dirt for centuries. A door, the grain-loading doorway, already existed. She would need to hang something in it, but barn boards would do. Fuel, that was the question. The whole theory depended on the walls doing the work. If they worked as she believed, she would need less fuel than a normal cabin. Perhaps half as much, perhaps less. She had equivalent to a quarter cord of firewood. If the walls worked, it might be enough for early winter. She would gather cow chips from the prairie, twist hay into burning cats like the Volga Germans did when wood was scarce. It would be close. Everything would be close. And if she was wrong, if the walls did not hold heat, if the small space could not stay warm, if the smoke choked them, or the cold crept through, then Heinrich Voth would be right. She would have killed her children chasing a theory that lived only in her memory of houses across an ocean. But the dugout was falling. The foundation could not become a house. The widow in haze awaited her if she gave up, and giving up meant losing everything Johann had died trying to build. She chose the granary. She walked home in the dark, Wilhelm sleeping against her back, her mind racing through lists of what she needed and what she could salvage. 8 weeks until frost. She had a stone cylinder with no roof, a theory about walls, and 3 children who were counting on her to be right. The wind picked up as she walked. It carried the smell of autumn, of grass turning dry, of the cold that was coming. Somewhere to the north, in the black sky, the first hard frost of the season was already forming. Reverend Karl Brenner arrived at Margaret's dugout on a Sunday afternoon in mid-September. He drove a black wagon and wore a black coat and had the expression of a man performing an unpleasant duty required by his station. Brenner was 58 years old. He had led the Lutheran congregation in Rush County since 1877. He considered himself the moral guardian of the German-Russian community, the keeper of traditions, the enforcer of proper order. Women without husbands were problems to be solved. Widows were meant to remarry or return to family. A widow with children who insisted on holding a claim alone was an offense against the natural hierarchy. He had a solution for Margret. His name was Gottlieb Mauer. "Gottlieb is a good man," Brenner said, standing in the yard while Margret kneaded bread in the dugout doorway. She did not invite him inside. The roof might collapse if he bumped the center beam. A widower himself with 4 children. He needs a wife. You need a husband. This is how God solves problems. "I have a claim to prove," Margaret said. "Gottlieb has a claim already proved. 160 acres, a sod house, a stone barn. You would be comfortable there. My children would be his. They would be cared for." Margret looked at him. Brenner had visited 3 times since Johann's death. Each time he had mentioned Gottlieb Mauer. Each time she had declined. He kept coming back. "What happens to my claim if I marry?" Brenner spread his hands. "It returns to the government. Someone else files. The land is not lost. It simply passes to another family." "Johann's family." "Johann is dead, Mrs. Roth. The dead have no claims." Margrethe returned to kneading the bread. Her arms ached. Everything ached now. The work of survival without help had worn her thin. "I am not marrying Gottlieb Mauer." Brenner's expression shifted. The pastoral concern sharpened into something harder. "I have heard about your project." "My project." "The burned granary, the Krieger ruin. People are talking." "Let them talk." They say you plan to live in it. A stone tube with no roof, a grain bin. He shook his head. This is pride, Mrs. Roth. Sinful pride. God took your husband for a reason, perhaps to teach you humility, perhaps to show you that a woman's place is not alone on a claim but beside a man who can provide. Margaret's hands stilled on the dough. God did not take my husband. Cholera did. And who sends disease but the Lord? She had no answer to that. She was too tired to argue theology with a man who had never buried a spouse, never worked a field alone, never wondered if his children would survive the winter. Brenner stepped closer. Gottlieb Maurer has offered a generous bride price, enough to settle Johann's debts and leave you something besides. He will raise your children as his own. They will have food, shelter, safety. I have food. I have shelter. I have safety. You have a collapsing hole in the ground and a fantasy about living in a wheat bin. His voice dropped. If you die in this foolishness, and you will die, Mrs. Roth, as surely as winter follows autumn, your children will be orphans. The church will place them with families who need labor. Anna will go to one house, Peter to another, Wilhelm to a third. He leaned closer, and she could smell the tobacco on his breath. They will be separated. They will never see each other again. Is that what you want? Margareta felt the cold spread through her chest. The threat was clear. If she failed, Brenner would ensure her family was destroyed. I will not fail, she said. Brenner smiled, a thin, patient smile. Pride comes before the fall, Mrs. Roth. I will pray for you. And when the cold comes, and you find yourself in need of Christian charity, I trust you will remember who offered it first. He climbed back into his wagon and drove away. Margaret stood in the yard, bread dough drying on her hands. Anna was watching from inside the dugout, her face pale. She had heard everything. Mama? Are we going to be separated? Margaret knelt and pulled her daughter close. No, never. I promise. It was a promise she had no right to make. Brenner was correct. If she failed, the church would take her children. The community that had abandoned her in life would claim her family in death. Anna to one farm, Peter to another, Wilhelm to whoever would take an infant with no labor to offer. She would not fail. She could not. 7 weeks until frost, no roof, no fuel, no community. She went back to work. A sigh. The charred timbers of the Krieger barn lay scattered across the burned foundation like the ribs of some enormous dead animal. Most were too damaged to use, split and cracked, weakened by fire until they crumbled at a touch. But 8 of them remained solid at their cores. The fire had blackened the outside, but not consumed the heart. Margaret spent 3 days hauling those timbers to the granary. She could not lift them alone. Each one weighed more than she did, so she dragged them, rope looped around her shoulders, leaning into the weight until her feet slipped and her muscles screamed. 1 mile each direction. 8 timbers. 24 miles of dragging through September heat that should have broken her, but did not. The children helped where they could. Anna, at 6, could gather small boards and carry tools. Peter, at 4, treated the work as a game. He raced ahead to the granary and back, counting Margaret's progress. Wilhelm watched from a blanket in the shade. Too young to help, too young to understand that his mother was rebuilding the world for him. The roof design was simple. Margaret had seen it used in Russia and again in Kansas. A center post with radiating beams like the spokes of a wheel. She dug a hole in the center of the granary floor and set the tallest salvaged timber upright in it, packing dirt around the base until it stood firm. The timber rose 12 feet, putting its top just below the level of the stone walls. Then she laid the remaining beams from the center post to the top of the walls, each one resting on the stone at one end and meeting the others at the center. The beams did not fit perfectly. Some were too long, others too short, but rope and scavenged nails held them in place. When she finished, the framework looked like the skeleton of an umbrella, blackened and crude, but functional. For roofing material, she cut sod. The prairie grass had deep roots. Each piece of sod was heavy, dense with earth and tangled fibers. She cut bricks of it, 2 feet long and 1 foot wide, and hauled them to the granary in a handcart she had made from barrel staves and wagon wheels salvaged from the Krieger debris. The work was back-breaking. The sod was wet from recent rain, adding weight she could barely lift. Her hands blistered, then calloused, then cracked and bled. She laid the sod over the beam framework in overlapping layers, grass side down, pressing each brick firmly against the ones beside it. The roof grew slowly, a few square feet per day, sealing the granary piece by piece against the sky. She left a hole near the center post for the stovepipe. She would deal with the chimney later. By the end of September, the roof was complete. It was ugly, lumpy with sod, sagging slightly between beams, but it held. When the first autumn rain came, the interior stayed dry. The water ran off the sod and into the grass, and the walls stood silent and dark and sealed against the world. The chimney was harder. Stone does not cut easily. Limestone is softer than granite, but still dense enough to resist a chisel. Margaret worked on a section of wall 8 feet above the floor, chipping away at the mortar between stones, trying to create an opening large enough for a stovepipe. An inch per day was optimistic. Progress was measured in the dust that accumulated on her clothes and the blood that seeped from her cracked fingertips. Friedrich Bauer found her on the 5th day of chipping, when she had penetrated perhaps 3 inches into the 22. He was 67 years old, a retired stonemason who had worked with Johann on the foundation. He had not spoken to Margaret since the funeral. He was walking the road to town when he saw her on a ladder inside the granary, hammer raised, chipping at stone that refused to yield. He watched for a long time. Then he sighed, climbed down into the granary, and took the hammer from her hand. "You are doing this wrong," he said. "I know. You need to drill guide holes first, then cut between them." He examined the wall, the pitiful holes she had made, the blood on her hands. "You need proper tools, a star drill, a heavier hammer. I do not have them. I do." He did not look at her. He looked at the wall, at the work remaining, at the impossibility of what she was attempting. He had known Johann. He had built stone with Johann. Watching Johann's widow destroy her hands on work she did not understand was more than his professional conscience could bear. "I will help you," he said. "One afternoon, I will show you how it is done, and you will finish yourself. People will talk. People already talk. They say you are mad. Perhaps they are right." He helped her for 4 hours. He drilled guide holes with his star drill, showing her the angle and the rhythm. He cut the chimney opening with a few dozen precise strikes that accomplished more than her 5 days of labor. When he left, the hole was through, 8 inches in diameter, angled slightly upward to draw smoke, 22 inches of limestone open to the sky. Margaret thanked him. He waved it away. "Johann would have done the same for my wife," he said. "This is not charity. This is debt." He walked away before anyone could see him leave. He never spoke of the afternoon again. October arrived. The first frost painted the prairie white on the morning of the 23rd. Margaret stood in the doorway of the granary, her stone house that everyone said would kill her, and watched her breath cloud in the cold air. The interior was transformed. Johann's box stove sat in the center, its pipe rising through the chimney hole and into the morning sky. The dirt floor had been packed and hardened with water until it was smooth and solid. Straw mattresses lined the curved walls, one for Margaret and Wilhelm, one for Anna and Peter. Blankets hung over the doorway to block drafts. Rope shelves held their meager supplies: 40 pounds of flour, dried beans, preserved vegetables in jars that Margaret had traded labor to obtain. Against the walls stood the fuel pile, cow chips gathered from the prairie, dried and stacked like bricks, twisted hay cats bundled in twine, a few scraps of wood salvaged from the debris. Altogether, perhaps the equivalent of 2 cords of firewood, 1/3 of what a normal family needed for a Kansas winter. Margaret lit the first fire on the night of October 24th. The stove crackled to life, smoke rising through the chimney and out into the cold. The interior of the granary was 43 degrees, barely above freezing, cold enough that the children huddled together on their mattress with blankets pulled to their chins. Within an hour, the air had warmed to 50 degrees. By midnight, it was 55. The stove had burned down to embers, the fire barely alive, but the stone walls were warm to the touch. Margaret pressed her palm against the limestone and felt it give back the heat it had taken. Sonnengedächtnis. She fed the stove small amounts through the night, a chip here, a haycat there, not enough to blaze but enough to maintain. The walls did the rest. They absorbed the heat and radiated it slowly, evenly, like the walls in Russia, like the clay houses of the Volga that her grandmother had known. By morning, the fire was dead, and the interior had dropped to 48 degrees. Cold, but not killing cold. And outside, frost still whitened the ground. The system worked, in October at least, but October was not January. 50 degrees above was not 20 degrees below. The first frost was nothing compared to the blizzards that would come. Margaret calculated her fuel supply against the weeks remaining. If she burned at this rate, she would last until February. Barely. Maybe. The margin was impossibly thin. November came, and the temperature dropped, and Margaret learned what her stone walls could do. On a night in mid-November, the mercury fell to 5 degrees below zero. The wind howled across the prairie at 40 miles per hour. Snow drove horizontal through the dark. Inside the frame cabin where the Larson family lived, 2 miles to the east, frost formed on the inside walls. The Larsons burned fuel so fast that Carl Larson had to venture into the storm twice to haul more wood from their pile. His wife, Ingrid, heated bricks on the stove and wrapped them in cloth, placing them in the children's beds to stop the shivering. Inside Margaret's granary, the temperature dropped from 52 degrees to 46. 6 degrees over a night that had killed cattle across the county. The walls held. Margaret burned fuel steadily through the cold snap, more than usual, enough to keep the stove fed, and the stone absorbed the heat and gave it back. When the wind screamed against the curved walls, it found no corners to grip, no cracks to penetrate. The circular shape deflected the gust like a river stone deflects water. The sod roof added its own insulation, trapping warmth inside the stone shell. Heinrich Voth heard about it from Friedrich Bauer. The Roth woman was surviving. Her stone bin was holding heat like a clay pot. Her children were alive. Voth did not believe it. He walked 3 miles through the snow to see for himself. He stood outside the granary, watching smoke rise from the chimney, and shook his head. "Wait until January," he said to no one. "Wait until the real cold, then we will see." But even as he said it, doubt crept into his voice. He had built 14 stone houses in Rush County, and none of them held heat the way this burned grain bin seemed to. The walls were thick, yes, but his houses had thick walls too. The difference was the shape. The difference was the size. The difference was something he had never thought to try. He did not knock on Margaretna's door. He turned and walked home through the snow, and the doubt walked with him. December passed. Christmas came and went, marked by nothing but an extra ration of sugar in the children's porridge and a prayer of thanks that they were still alive. The fuel pile shrank, but not as fast as Margaret had feared. She was burning perhaps half what a normal cabin required. The walls were doing their work, remembering the sun even when the sun was hidden behind gray clouds for days at a stretch. But the margin grew thinner every week. The haycats were nearly gone. The cow chips were half depleted. She had perhaps the equivalent of half a cord left, enough for one more month if the cold stayed moderate, nowhere near enough if January brought what January usually brought. And Wilhelm was coughing. It started in the first week of January, a small cough, wet and rattling, the kind that came with colds in winter. Margrethe was not worried at first. Children coughed, children recovered. The granary was warm enough, he would be fine, but the cough grew worse. By January 10th, Wilhelm was running a low fever. By January 11th, he could not nurse without coughing so hard he choked. Margrethe held him through the night, listening to his breathing, counting the seconds between each rattling exhale, praying that morning would bring improvement. Morning brought warmth instead, a false warmth, a January thaw that felt like a miracle. The temperature rose to 32 degrees, the snow began to melt, and Wilhelm's fever seemed to ease. Margaret stepped outside to gather the last of the cow chips from the edges of the fuel pile, taking advantage of the mild weather to stock what she could. The sky to the northwest was clear. The wind was calm. The children played in the muddy slush outside the granary door, laughing for the first time in weeks. It was January 12th, 1888, and 70 miles to the northwest, invisible and unstoppable, a wall of Arctic air was racing south at 40 miles per hour. The storm came from nowhere. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the sky was clear. At 10:30, a black wall appeared on the northwestern horizon, moving faster than a galloping horse. By 11, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. By noon, it had dropped 40 more. Margaret was outside when the front hit. She had walked 50 yards from the granary to gather the last scattered cow chips from the edges of her fuel pile when the wind struck her like a fist. One moment she was standing, the next she was on her knees in mud that was already freezing solid. Snow drove horizontal, so thick she could not see her hand in front of her face. The cold was like nothing she had ever felt. Not cold, but violence. A physical assault that drove the breath from her lungs and turned her skin to fire. She crawled. The granary was 50 yards away. She had walked that distance in seconds an hour ago, but now she could not see it, could not find it, could not orient herself in the white chaos that had swallowed the world. She moved on hands and knees, feeling for the familiar ground, calling for Anna, though she knew her voice would not carry through the roar. Her hand struck stone. The curved wall of the granary rose before her, and she followed it around to the doorway, pulled back the blanket that served as a door, and fell inside. The children were screaming. Anna had pulled Peter and Wilhelm into the center of the room, away from the walls, and was holding them both while the wind shrieked through gaps around the door frame and snow drove in white streamers across the floor. Margaret sealed the door as best she could, stuffing rags into gaps, pressing blankets against the frame, blocking the wind that fought to enter. The stove was cold. She had let the fire die in the mild morning. She fumbled for kindling, her fingers numb and clumsy, and struck a match that blew out instantly from the drafts. She struck another. Another. On the 5th try, the kindling caught, and she fed it chips and hay cats until flames roared up the stovepipe and warmth began to push back against the killing cold. The interior temperature was 52 degrees when the storm hit. The walls were warm from days of careful heating. Margaret stoked the fire high, higher than she had burned all winter, and watched the stone drink in the heat while outside the world ended. Wilhelm was burning with fever. She had not noticed in the chaos of the storm's arrival, but when she lifted him from Anna's arms, his skin was hot to the touch. The cough that had worried her for days had become something worse, a rattling, gasping struggle for breath that shook his tiny body with each exhale. His eyes were glassy. His lips had a bluish tinge that terrified her. The fever needed warmth. The storm demanded fuel. She could not give Wilhelm what he needed without burning through her reserves. She could not save fuel without letting the temperature drop and risking his life. She fed the fire. Chip after chip, hay-cat after hay-cat, she fed the stove until the interior rose to 55 degrees, then 58. Wilhelm stopped shivering. His breathing eased slightly. The stone walls absorbed the heat, warming degree by degree, storing the fire's energy in 22 inches of limestone. Outside, the temperature was already below zero and falling. The hours passed in a blur of wind and cold, and the steady consumption of fuel. At noon, the temperature outside was zero. Inside, the granary held at 50 degrees. Wilhelm was sleeping fitfully, his fever neither rising nor breaking. Anna and Peter huddled on their mattress, wrapped in every blanket, watching their mother feed the stove with the steady rhythm of someone bailing water from a sinking boat. At 2 o'clock, the temperature outside was 15 below zero. Inside, the granary had dropped to 48 degrees despite the blazing fire. The cold was overwhelming the system, more heat escaping through the roof and door than the walls could absorb. Margaret burned faster, feeding chips 2 at a time now, watching the fuel pile shrink with each hour. The wind was the worst. It found every gap, every crack, every imperfection in the sod roof and the blanket door. It drove snow into the interior in fine white powder that accumulated in corners and along the base of the walls. The stovepipe rattled and shook. Twice Margaret had to climb on a barrel to push it back into alignment when Gus threatened to tear it loose. At 4 o'clock, the temperature outside was 22 below zero. Inside, the granary was 46 degrees. Margaret had burned through half the fuel she had brought inside that morning. The pile outside was unreachable, buried under drifts, invisible in the white darkness. Whatever she had inside was all she would have until the storm passed. She did the calculation. At this rate, she would run out of fuel by midnight. If the storm lasted longer and blizzards on the plains could last 3 days, she would have nothing left to burn by morning. The walls were warm. She could feel them radiating when she pressed her palm against the stone. But the fire was the engine. Without the fire, the walls would give back what they had stored and then go cold. The system worked, but only as long as she could feed it. Wilhelm's fever spiked at 5 o'clock. He woke screaming, his body rigid, his temperature so high that Margaret could feel the heat rising off him like steam. She stripped him naked and bathed him with water from the drinking bucket, tepid water that felt cold against his burning skin. She held him and rocked him and sang the songs her grandmother had sung in Russia, songs about rivers and forests and homes that stayed warm through the coldest nights. The fever broke at 7 o'clock. Wilhelm went limp in her arms, soaked with sweat, breathing easier than he had in days. When he opened his eyes, they were clear. When he reached for her breast, he nursed without coughing. Margaret wept. Silent tears that froze on her cheeks in the cold air. Her baby was alive. The crisis within the crisis had passed, but the storm had not passed, and the fuel was almost gone. At 8 o'clock, the temperature outside was 28 below zero. Inside, the granary was 40 degrees. Margaret stopped feeding the stove. She had perhaps a dozen chips left, a handful of haycats, a few scraps of wood. If she burned them now, she would have nothing for the night. If she saved them, the temperature would drop, but the walls would radiate their stored heat for hours. She made the only choice she could. She banked the fire to embers and wrapped her children in every piece of cloth she owned. They huddled together on the floor in the center of the room, the warmest spot, where the walls radiated from all directions. Margareta pressed Wilhelm against her chest, pulled Anna and Peter tight against her sides, and covered them all with blankets until only their faces showed. The stone walls breathed heat into the room, not much heat, not enough heat, but heat that came from the stones themselves, from the 22 inches of limestone that had absorbed a day's worth of fire and were now giving it back. The air temperature dropped 40 degrees, 38, 36, but the walls stayed warm to the touch. The radiation was constant even, a slow release that defied the killing cold outside. At 10 o'clock, the interior was 34 degrees. The fire was dead. The fuel was gone except for a few chips Margaret was saving for morning, if morning ever came. At midnight, the interior was 32 degrees, exactly freezing, cold enough that breath hung in the white clouds, cold enough that the water in the bucket had a skin of ice, but not cold enough to kill. The walls were still warm. Margaret reached out from under the blankets and pressed her palm against the stone. It was cool now, not warm, not comforting, but not the deadly cold of the air outside. The limestone was giving up its last reserves, the final heat it had stored from a fire that seemed a lifetime ago. She did not sleep. She lay awake through the night, listening to her children breathe, counting the seconds between each exhale, waiting for the moment when breath would stop. It did not stop. The walls held. Second, 2 miles to the east, the Larson family was fighting for survival in a different way. Their frame cabin had thin walls, 4 inches of pine lumber, gaps chinked with mud and straw. When the storm hit, the interior temperature dropped almost as fast as the temperature outside. By evening, ice had formed on the inside of the windows. By midnight, frost covered the interior walls in white feathers that sparkled in the lamplight. Carl Larson burned fuel as fast as he could throw it on the fire. He burned the wood pile. He burned the fence posts stacked behind the cabin. He burned 2 chairs and a table that had belonged to Ingrid's mother. The fire roared, but the thin walls could not hold the heat. It escaped as fast as he could make it. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the fuel was gone. The cabin began to drop toward the killing temperature. Carl did the only thing he could think of. He went to the lean-to where their milk cow stood shivering and slit its throat. The family crawled inside the carcass. The body heat of a dying cow was enough to keep them alive through the night. They huddled in blood and viscera, their children crying, Ingrid silent with shock, while the cabin around them dropped to 10 below zero. The cow saved their lives. But it cost them their livelihood. Without the cow, they would have no milk, no butter, no way to survive the spring. 4 miles to the west, the Brandt family rode out the storm in their sod house. The thick earthen walls perform much like Margaretted stone, absorbing heat, radiating it slowly, moderating the temperature swings that killed families and frame houses. The Brandts had more fuel, more space, more margin. They never faced the desperate calculations that Margaret faced. But their sod house proved the principle. Thermal mass saved lives. 6 miles to the north, a family whose name was never recorded did not survive. They were found in spring when the snow melted. A man, a woman, 2 children, frozen in their beds in a frame cabin that had offered no protection against the cold. The fire had gone out. The walls had done nothing. They died in their sleep as the temperature dropped around them. Across the Great Plains, 235 people died that night and the following day. Children walking home from school were caught in the open and froze within sight of their homes. Women were found in snowdrifts, blinded by the white chaos, 50 feet from their front doors. A teacher in Nebraska led her students into a haystack and kept them alive by having them march in place through the night. 3 lost toes, but all survived. Another teacher tried to lead her students home and lost 5 of them in the snow. The storm would be remembered as the Children's Blizzard, the Schoolhouse Blizzard, the deadliest January storm in Plains history. Margaret knew none of this as she lay awake in her stone cylinder, holding her children, watching her breath cloud in the freezing air. She knew only that the walls were still warm, that her children were still breathing, and that the night would end eventually. It ended at 6 o'clock in the morning when the first gray light of January 13th filtered through the gaps in the blanket door. The temperature at dawn was 34 degrees below zero, the coldest reading of the storm. Inside the granary, the air was 32 degrees. The walls had given everything they had, and now they were cold, truly cold, the same temperature as the air around them. The system had reached equilibrium. The fire was dead. The fuel was gone. The heat that had kept them alive was exhausted. But the children were breathing. Margaret fed the last chips to the stove and coaxed a small flame back to life. The heat felt like resurrection. Within an hour, the interior had climbed to 40 degrees. Within 2 hours, to 45. The walls began absorbing again, drinking in the warmth, preparing to give it back when night fell. She opened the door. The world outside was white and silent. Snow lay 4 feet deep where the wind had piled it against the granary wall. The shape of the fuel pile was gone, buried under drifts that would take days to dig out. The prairie stretched to the horizon, unbroken, unmarked by any sign of human presence. Nothing moved. The wind had stopped. The killing cold hung in the air like a held breath. Margaret stood in the doorway, Wilhelm in her arms, and looked at the world that had tried to kill her children. Behind her, Anna appeared. Then Peter. They stood together in the doorway of the stone cylinder that everyone had said would be their tomb. The walls had held. The son's memory had been enough. Calm. Heinrich Foth came on the 3rd day after the storm, when the roads had been broken and the dead had begun to be counted. He did not announce himself. He stood outside the granary for a long time, looking at the structure, at the smoke rising from the chimney, at the evidence of survival where he had predicted death. Then he ducked through the doorway and stood in the center of the room. Margaret was nursing Wilhelm. Anna was playing with a rag doll she had made from scraps. Peter was sleeping. The interior was 52 degrees, warm enough to be comfortable, warm enough that the children had pushed off their heaviest blankets. Voth looked at the walls. He placed his palm against the stone and held it there. "The walls are 2 feet thick," he said. "I knew that." Margaret said nothing. "The roof is crude but solid." He looked up at the sod that had held through 60-mile-per-hour winds. "I did not expect that." Margaret said nothing. "The space is small. I thought that was a weakness." He turned slowly, taking in the room, the single stove, the mattresses pressed against the curved walls, the 4 people who had survived in a space smaller than most kitchens. "I was wrong." He stood there for a long moment, his hand still pressed against the stone. When he spoke again, his voice was different, not the voice of the authority skeptic delivering verdicts, but the voice of a man who had spent his life building houses and had just realized he had missed something fundamental. "I told you that you would freeze in this thing," he said. "I told you that you would kill those children." He looked at Anna, who was watching him with solemn eyes. At Peter, who had woken and was peering out from under his blanket. At Wilhelm, nursing peacefully at Margaretta's breast. I was wrong. He said it simply without excuse or qualification. A stonemason who had built 14 houses, admitting that a widow with no training had found something he had missed. The stone holds the heat, he said, almost to himself. Like a clay pot holds water. The more you heat it, the more it gives back. In the round shape, there are no corners for the wind to find, no weak points. The air moves around it instead of pushing through. He had known these principles. Every stonemason knew them. But he had never applied them this way. He built houses square because houses were square. He built houses large because large houses showed prosperity. He had never considered that small and round and thick might be better than large and square and thin. Others will want to know how you did this, he said. The Larsons lost their cow keeping warm, the family north of the Brants. He stopped. Others will want to know. Then I will tell them, Margaret said. I have no secrets. Voth nodded. He turned to leave, then stopped at the doorway. Your husband was a careful man, he said. He laid a good foundation. He would be proud of what you built on it. He left before she could respond. Anna Krieger came a week later. She had not left Kansas after all. She had been waiting in Hays, waiting to see what would happen to the granary her husband had built and the woman who had dared to live in it. She walked around the structure twice, touching the walls, looking at the roof that Margaret had built from charred timbers and prairie sod. When she finally came inside, her face held something that had not been there before. Not hope, exactly, but the absence of despair. My husband and I built this for wheat, she said. We never thought of it as a house. Neither did I, Margaret replied, until I had no choice. Anna sat on an overturned bucket and watched the fire crackle in the stove. I said you would suffocate or freeze. I said the walls would not save you. You were not wrong to doubt. I doubted, too. But you did it anyway. I had 3 children and no alternatives. Anna was silent for a long moment. Then, I'm thinking of filing a new claim, a small place, just for me. Would you? She stopped, started again. Would you teach me? How you built the roof? How you cut the chimney? Margaret stood and took Anna's hand. I will show you everything, and you will help me show others. They spent the afternoon drawing diagrams in the dirt floor, discussing angles and measurements, and the principle that Margaret's grandmother had called Sonnengedächtnis, the sun's memory. By the time Anna left, she had the beginnings of a plan. She was not the last to come asking. Reverend Brenner did not visit Margaret. He addressed the congregation instead, from the safety of his pulpit, on the Sunday after the roads were cleared. God in his wisdom preserved the Roth family from the storm, he said. Let us not presume that this was human wisdom. Let us remember that God moves in mysterious ways, and that what appeared to be foolishness was merely his instrument. He did not acknowledge that he had predicted her death. He did not acknowledge that he had threatened to separate her children. He did not acknowledge that he had been wrong. But when Margaret walked into church that Sunday, the first time since Johann's funeral, no one crossed the street to avoid her. The women who had refused to help now nodded in greeting. The men who had taken Johann's tools now looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Gottlieb Mauer, the widower Brenner had chosen for her, sat in the back pew. He did not approach her after the service. He did not approach her ever again. Brenner had lost his power. The woman who was supposed to fail had succeeded. The community that had abandoned her now had to reckon with what that meant. Margaret did not demand apologies. She did not seek vindication. She simply lived in her stone cylinder with her children through the rest of that winter and into the spring. The victory was enough. By the spring of 1889, 7 stone structures modeled on Margaret's design stood in Rush County. Heinrich Foth built 3 of them himself, each one smaller and thicker walled than the square houses he had built before. The designs varied. Some were rectangular with rounded corners, some circular like the original, but all shared the principle: thick stone walls, small interior volume, heavy roofs. Margaret showed every family who asked how the walls absorbed and released heat, how the circular shape shed wind, how less space meant less fuel. She drew diagrams and demonstrated techniques and answered questions until her voice gave out. She never asked for payment. Johann had died trying to build a large stone house like the ones in Russia. His wife survived by building a small one. The method spread beyond Rush County. Settlers in Barton, Ann Ness, and Ellis counties heard the story and came to see. Some adapted the design for their own needs: stone cellars with earthen roofs, half-buried structures that used the ground itself as thermal mass. The principle was simple enough that anyone could understand it. The walls remember the sun. Margaret Roth proved up her claim in 1892, 5 years after Johann's death. She never remarried. She expanded the stone granary twice, adding a stone-walled addition for the children as they grew, and eventually a separate stone kitchen. She lived on the claim until her death in 1917, at age 59. Anna Roth married a farmer from Ness County in 1903. Peter Roth took over the homestead when Margaretten's health began to fail. Wilhelm Roth, the infant who had burned with fever through the worst night of the children's blizzard, became a school teacher in Hayes and lived until 1961. The original granary, 12 feet across, walls 22 inches thick, stood until 1943, when it was finally demolished to make way for a modern grain elevator. By then, no one remembered that it had once been a house. No one remembered that a widow and 3 children had survived the deadliest January in Plains history inside its walls. The stones were carted away and used to build a fence. The fence still stands. On January 12, 1888, the temperature in Rush County, Kansas, dropped 50 degrees in 3 hours. The wind reached 60 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to 0. Across the Great Plains, 235 people died in what would be remembered as the Children's Blizzard. Heinrich Voth, who had survived 11 Kansas winters and built 14 stone houses in Rush County, had stood in Margaret Roth's yard 5 months before and delivered his verdict. "A stone foundation is not a house," he had said. "You cannot raise walls alone. You cannot cut enough fuel." He had looked at her children, Anna, Peter, Wilhelm, and spoken the words that should have been her death sentence. "A woman with 3 children and no husband has no business on a claim in winter. You will freeze in that thing, and those children will freeze with you." On the morning of January 13th, 1888, the temperature stood at 34 degrees below 0. The coldest reading of the storm. Inside the stone granary that had once held wheat, after a night with no fire, the air was 32 degrees, exactly freezing, cold enough to see your breath, cold enough to ache, warm enough to live. Anna was 6, Peter was 4. Wilhelm was 19 months old. They were wrapped in blankets on the dirt floor, pressed against their mother's body, breathing. Outside, the snow lay 4 feet deep. The world was white and silent and utterly still. 235 people had died in the night, scattered across 1,000 miles of frozen prairie. Inside the stone walls, Margaret Roth opened her eyes and counted her children's breaths. 1, 2, 3, and felt the walls give back their final warmth, the last memory of yesterday's sun. The stones had remembered. Her children were alive.